Hi, this is Anthony Parent of IRSMedic. I've been a tax attorney for many years, and I often get this question. What country can I move to where I won't get extradited for tax evasion? Now, this is a question I never would answer because that answer someone could implicate me into some sort of tax evasion. But this is what I would say. I would say, well, the general rule is that if a law is a felony in both countries that is punishable by a year or more in jail, that means it is likely something that you can be extradited for. And then there's a whole host of playing that game, and there's a whole bunch of risks if you do go down that road. And my good friend John Richardson has alerted one of those such risks to my attention. And the news is from Mexico, that Mexico changed its tax laws. And I'll let John explain of the rest of what happened.
This is actually, before we focus on the extradition stuff per se, this is all part of a post that I did, which was to generally describe what I think is a fact that as problematic as U.S. tax laws can be for people, residents of other countries, meaning Americans abroad, also need to be concerned with the changes in the internal laws of the country where they may live. Because interestingly, and I think for many people surprisingly, changes in your country of residence can in fact change your tax relationship with the United States. And so, perhaps before we get into the whole Mexico extradition thing, which is unquestionably the most newsworthy item, I think that affects far fewer people than some of the other examples that I put in the post. And I'm going to give you a couple of, I'll give you, a few examples. So again, to be clear, what we're talking about is no change in U.S. law whatsoever, no change in U.S. law. You're just sitting there living in another country, tax resident in another country, and you wake up and you find changes in your own country's tax laws, which actually have a profound impact on your tax relationship with the United States and can change all kinds of things in different ways. And let me give you a few examples. This post was 20, 30-minute special at most, okay, that I just sort of put together when I realized this. But one example that I see a lot of is in Canada, a lot of people have made a lot of money selling real estate over the years. And basically in Canada, if you sell your principal residence, it's a tax-free capital gain. Well, I think the Canada Revenue Agency perhaps imagined that there might be people who were selling real estate and excluding the capital gain based on the principal residence exemption. So, and I think it was 2016, Canada actually changed their laws to require the reporting on the Canadian tax return of any time that you sell a principal residence and are not treating the gain as taxable because it's a principal residence. Now, as you know, Anthony, when you do U.S. tax returns for Americans abroad, my guess is that you say, show me your tax returns from Canada, or show me your tax returns, wherever you live.
Yep.
And, it's funny, in 2016, apparently. And what's interesting about this, and I've actually seen this, is that since that time, when a U.S. tax preparer would see the Canadian return, they would be alerted to the fact that there was, in fact, a sale of a principal residence, when they never would have been alerted to that before. And of course, the taxpayer in Canada, would have no reason to think it was taxable in the U.S. So what's interesting is that particular small information reporting change in Canada has definitely caused a number of people to pay tax on the sale of their principal residence when they never would have paid before, not because they were trying to avoid the tax, but because they never knew that in the U.S. that particular gain was taxable. And of course, if a tax preparer is just, preparing returns based on the Canadian returns, they wouldn't have picked that up either. So that's an interesting one. A second interesting one would be, people who carry on businesses through small business corporations in Canada, commonly referred to as Canadian-controlled private corporations. Well, before you hit the record button, we were talking about, the whole guilty and subpart F, right? This whole regime, which exists in the U.S. to basically force the U.S. citizen to include the company's income on their personal tax return, whether it's distributed or not. But there are certain exceptions to that. For example, with subpart F income, which is basically investment income earned inside the company, if the Canadian tax rate for that particular category of income were 90% or more of the U.S. tax rate, then that would be excluded from the mandatory income exclusion, right? So imagine in Canada, the government of the day says, we're going to reduce our corporate tax rates. Well, if they reduce those corporate tax rates and they reduce them such that they're now below 90% of the U.S. corporate tax rate, in this case 18.9%, then all of a sudden, by doing that to help Canadians, those who are U.S. citizens are now required to include that income on their return. So, this is really, it's interesting. I think even beyond me, okay, I think it's interesting.
You know what? And I bet some of our viewers have examples too. I invite people to share some examples of changes in laws you got to be watching out for, because here's really what John's getting to is that you could be you could have a controlled foreign corporation in Canada for years and say, yeah, I never have to pay U.S. taxes. It's basically because the taxes are high. But there's a change there to how something's done. Your taxes are lower. Now, something you never knew anything about, subpart F income. Subpart F income, which is something that John and I hope to tackle pretty soon, an updated guide to that. That is something that could be a real trigger, and someone can examine your returns and say, oh, no, you have this all wrong, and what have you been doing? And you basically were just going along.
But what also it also is looking, sorry to interrupt, but this really drives home the point that you really need to have a professional. If you're doing your U.S. taxes, let's say in Canada or in France, to have a professional that knows both systems do it.
Yeah.
Would you agree?
I actually go a little bit further. As someone who does this, you actually have to know too. And that if you're relying on a tax preparer, I'm sorry, it's not good enough. You need to know this stuff. You do, because.
And how do you know this stuff?
And that's you. So what you want to do and what we try to do is get our clients to understand, what's going on in their return, so they could look at the picture. How does this all work in relation? And that's what John and I are talking about, kind of giving a guide for people to say, well, what should my tax return look like? What are these things that I've heard about? And even, you might have heard about CFC, subpart F, guilty, transition tax. You might have heard these things in passing and not necessarily know how they interrelate. And that's where I think the issue is that and really from my own experience, preparing these complicated returns, and a conversation that I had yesterday with some incredible tax preparers, guys I would trust in a million years to file 5471. Our conversation was how there's really no perfect 5471. There really isn't. And you can find errors with kind of every one. And then when you're reviewing ones in years past, you're like, oh, they did an error in that year. And then you're like, well, what do you do about that?
Wow.
Oh, and you're just sort of like, okay, this is your face. If you're watching me on YouTube, this is my face. I look at the screen like, oh man, what are you going to do with this? This is kind of, so there's a lot that goes into it, and essentially, but this is what we sort of, the takeaway of it is that, as long as you understand what's going on, how it all works together, you actually can't get that far off. You can't get they're the number you're in your head. You should be able to wait. The number should be about this because of this. Then that's letting you know what it is. But I think what we're talking about, and Keith, this is what, as our resident layman, who is paying, of the people in your group, how many of them are tracking their own country of residence laws? And
I could take a guess. I'll just take a guess just based on my experience. Probably not many. I mean, I don't have there's no statistics I have, but unless you're quite astute.
Yeah,
doing it.
And I think, Keith, we always said, you got to get a qualified professional, and it's true. It is true. But your qualified professional is you understand who your qualified professional is going to be. It's going to be a person. It's not going to be a superhero. It's going to be
Yeah.
a person who has scarcity of resources mentally as much as anybody else. And for them to know every law in every country is an impossible task. And someone who's even very good at this, you need to know, you need to tell them what's going on. And it's something you just like, okay, they took care of it. And this is the thing you need to understand, which drives me nuts on this, that we all, yesterday I was sitting down with these guys and we all agreed. We all agreed not any one person in this world is good enough to do these. We're all, and we consider each other to be really good. And
So
we're just
what
sort of
you're
fighting.
saying, what you're saying is that for me, a layperson, any change, and I think, John, any change in your tax code or law in your country, you need to take a look at to see how it will affect your U.S. tax return.
To me, that sounds like the right advice.
Any
It really
change,
does.
it might not affect it, but it could affect it seriously.
Yeah.
But you
And
got to look
that's
at every one.
right. And in your individual country expat group, you all need to be talking about that. You're going to be the only ones because the residents in the country aren't going to care. All
Right.
the changes, because as John says, hey, you lowered the Canadian tax rate. Hey, thanks. Everyone else is cheering. And you're like, oh, that's good too. But like, oh, hold on, that comes with a cost. Oh, what's that? Oh, that's the thing. There's not going to be anyone else in your situation in your country other than a U.S. expat. And so and I would say this, I've learned a lot of great information from my clients who are really dialed into their expat group. That's where like, oh, hey, we were talking about this in a group. We found this. Like, look at them like, oh, yeah, you guys got something. That happens a lot. I'm like, oh, wow.
Yeah,
And it's just
but I
like,
do, I agree with you. You have to be your own advocate, absolutely.
yeah,
But I think if you go to a professional who, let's say, only deals with Canada and the U.S.
yep.
or only deals with France and the U.S., you'll have a better opportunity of having somebody who's going to know it much better than somebody who's doing it across a lot of countries. Would
And
you agree?
I would agree with that. The issue is that finding those people is incredibly difficult. And there seems to be, and this has been our issue. There's a shortage of, we're talking about supply chain issues. I'll tell you my supply chain issue. Finding COVID just blew up tax preparation, and it's really, really hard to have the staff. And we've gotten lucky late in this year. We've gotten very lucky, and I want to thank this channel for bringing the talent that we have gotten. And I also want to say, if there are people watching this channel and you want to be a part of a firm that wants to be part of the solution and really looks at this tax as the evil it is, you can please send me an email to aparent@irsmedic.com. We are looking for more tax preparers and more people to help with the IRS as they are gearing up. And this is the thing. This is industry wide. The advantage I have is I have this channel. And other firms just they're not. They are even doing. They've done worse. So that is what people need to understand. Finding that quality help. And I've known of great guys. Great guy. Oh, here's this guy in Italy. He does returns really cheap, really good. Yeah, he's not around anymore. Like, oh boy. He was really good. So there's a lot of those. There's a lot of really awesome local guys in those countries, and it's just a nightmare to find them. And that's honestly why people, often come to us like, look, I couldn't find anyone. You're the best I could come. And we're generally familiar with most country stuff. But I would say, the person who's actually living there and eats, and knows and prepares that country's tax return too, they are going to be more dialed into all the changes. They just will be. So yeah, if I could find that person, that's what I would do if I could do that. Otherwise, yeah, I would probably look to the internet to find out, okay, who else? Okay, I couldn't find anyone local. Who else knows this? Who else will I get along with? That's really what's going on here. Just go
Okay. Well, just sort of, yeah, I mean, picking up the discussion, okay. This is an interesting post, okay. I wrote it probably in 20 minutes without even having any conscious thought that I
did a great job.
before it
Beautiful
started.
job.
But this got started when I read on, I think it was an article on Reuters or somewhere, about how, uh, one or more U.S. citizens were being extradited from Mexico back to the United States over tax evasion charges. And the implication was that this is a relatively new thing, a new process. And and then the article sort of hinted at that it actually had nothing to do with the U.S. And what it had to do with was the fact that Mexico changed the way it defined certain tax laws and the sentencing. And so, in other words, to continue the theme, it was that change in Mexico law internally that brought the circumstances of this U.S. citizen in Mexico within the intended purview of the U.S.-Mexico extradition treaty, right? And, there are a few examples like this in comparison to the things that we started talking about, those pedestrian changes. But this is very, very interesting. And so going through the treaty, I think let me just emphasize that, again, this is quick research, okay? This is not, getting into it in a big way. But the bottom line is that it was the change in the Mexico law that did this and not any change in the treaty per se, right? Or any change in U.S. law. So speaking generally for a moment here about U.S. extradition treaties, there are newer ones and there are older ones. And they're really quite interesting because, at least from my point of view, they're interesting because they mostly have nothing to do with what people think extradition actually is. Most people imagine extradition is about, somebody, murders their brother or something, in the United States and flees the country, say over to Canada, and, the U.S. says, hey, send this alleged murderer back, etc. And if my brother's listening to this, not to worry, okay, it was just an arbitrary example. But so the older extradition treaties define specific offenses, right, for which, one can be extradited. The older ones define
right. Yeah, we have too many laws for that now.
And the newer ones are what I call dual criminality treaties, which means simply this, that if you can allege an offense that is a crime, certain kind of crime under the laws of both countries, all right? And in this case, my reading of this is that it's a crime, punishable with a minimum year incarceration. And then, you can get extradition for this. In other words, what this does is get you around having to rely on allegations of violating very specific kinds of crimes, and turns the focus more to not so much what the crime is, but whether the circumstances giving rise to the crime would give rise to a crime, not necessarily the crime, but a crime in each of the two countries, punishable by I think a minimum of 1 year jail sentence. And that is, I think, what happened here. I also would like to say, though, that what's very, very clear with these newer dual criminality treaties is that they really are for the purpose of actually extending U.S. criminal law outside the United States, right? Because if you can get a country to agree to extradite at the request of the United States for conduct that basically constitutes a crime in either country, regardless of where the crime is committed, that's a very powerful tool to expand U.S. criminal law jurisdiction around the world. And one of the most recent examples that I've always been fascinated by, and I think is worth mentioning, is this thing that was going on up until about a year ago, where this Huawei, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, the Chinese telecom company executive, was basically arrested in Canada and Vancouver Airport for conduct that took place outside both Canada and the United States. All right, and basically, went through this whole extradition process for, 2 years in Canada. And, that's, I think, a perfect example of how these extradition treaties are designed to get at people who have no, physical connection whatsoever. Not only with the United States, but even with a country that's arresting the person courtesy of the United States, right? And this is really frightening stuff, because you look at the Meng Wanzhou, I think was her name, Meng Wanzhou, the Chinese, so she was basically holed up, admittedly in rather luxurious surroundings, in Vancouver, British Columbia for a couple of years, where her battery of lawyers was, defending this. And by the way, they were not all that successful. I mean, it's very, very difficult because the bar to extradition is low. Eventually, of course, a deal was struck where she was let go. And in the meantime, China had arrested, I think fairly arbitrarily, 2 Canadians and locked them up. And locked them up not in palatial splendor, the way Meng Wanzhou was living, but rather in rather decrepit Chinese prisons. While I'm on this is a particular problem in the UK where there's a perception of gross inequality in the extradition treaties, and the United States is using this to extradite Julian Assange. I mean, there's a lot of sentiment against that, or a guy named Michael Lynch, which was fascinating. Because Michael Lynch was somebody who just, a British entrepreneur, a telecom entrepreneur who sold his company to, it may have been Hewlett Packard, but anyway, it was some U.S. company. They investigated the books, obviously. His books were done according to British accounting principles. I mean, that's where the company was located. They agreed to the sale. Then they decided they'd been defrauded. Bit rich, I think, given that they had access to the books, but whatever. But the interesting point is that the U.S. using the extradition treaty to extradite this guy to the United States. Okay. Notice this is something that has no real relation to the United States at all. Conduct outside the United States, but is also using extradition for commercial purposes, effectively, right? So this is, I think, very serious stuff. It's very, very interesting stuff. And this all takes place in the context of the U.S. refusal to extradite Ann Sekulis to Britain after she, driving on the wrong side of the road, managed to, kill this British teenager. And interestingly, just yesterday, she pleaded guilty by video link to some kind of criminal charge in the UK over this thing. But, let me just say this. These extradition treaties are not what you think they are.
But if the U.S., let's say, transitioned to a residency-based taxation, how much of this would be applicable?
Well, I mean, it wouldn't be applicable. Which, the answer is that to the extent that people are no longer U.S. tax residents,
right,
then, they're not going to be, subject to U.S. laws and compliance things, right? But, in this case, the extradition was actually based on most people's traditional view of what extradition is, namely somebody committing a crime in the United States and then leaving the United States.
Yeah.
Et cetera. So, I mean, it wouldn't affect this kind of person. I don't know. All right. But what I have, begun to see just through aging and life is that, sometimes events that appear to be completely innocuous, make the last page of the paper, turn out to be, very significant historically.
Yes.
Yeah, that's true.
And I think that, I'm going to be brutally honest here, okay? When I look at the Meng Wanzhou thing, I find this incredibly offensive because, well, first of all, so there's a crime committed in the United States. Well, the background of the thing is the Trump administration pulled out of the Iran nuclear agreement, and then, basically tried to impose U.S. sanctions according to U.S. law on anybody or certain people who would do business with Iran. So then we have Meng Wanzhou in Hong Kong trying to get a loan from a bank somewhere or other that was not a U.S. bank. The point was that she was, doing business with Iran in violation of U.S. sanctions. But how did she do this? Well, apparently by, their allegation was putting false information on the loan application.
Hey John, I see we're running up on time right now. What would you say is the biggest takeaway from today?
The biggest takeaway from today is exactly what the blog post is, okay? The changes in the laws of your own country can have an effect on your legal relationship, including tax relationship with the United States.
That's absolutely right. And there's a lot of tricks out here, and it's scary. I mean, it gets scary out here. So Keith, what do you think, what are you going to go back to your people and tell them?
What I'm going to tell them is to listen to this podcast when it comes out, and to be quite fastidious when they are doing their resident country tax returns, and to be up to speed on any changes moving forward, and to see how it will affect them with those who are doing filing a U.S. tax return. They're going to have to look at every change and to see how it'll affect or not affect, but you got to check it all out.
And I want to echo exactly what you two have said here. John, you're absolutely right. These small little changes can have a huge, huge impact that you're not even paying attention to. There's no change in U.S. tax law, but your life has changed drastically. And Keith, I want to echo, what you said is that you got to be on top of this. You can't expect that your tax preparer or someone was going to be alerted to all the relevant things that could affect you. And you are responsible for you. There's not and
be your own advocate.
Yeah, and that's right. And remember that the tax code says this tax prep is a non-delegable duty. Now, you may hire me, you may hire John, you may hire someone else to do it, but ultimately, you're still on the hook. And anything that I do, guess what? You ratify it. So that's why you got to make sure, understand what this really is. So that is, we got to be, we got to stay protected here. Now, and to help in this, John and I were talking before this podcast. I think one of the greatest helps we can do is sort of give a general blueprint to how these various things work, so that you know in your own mind what your tax return should look like. You should know what the numbers should be. We're talking about the GILTI, we're talking about subpart F, control foreign income. The other things, how these all work, we're going to do. So John and I are going to do a nice little, podcast, really meant for the person who's not a tax professional to say, okay, what is this? But the truth is if you, the code treats you as if you have the resources of a Fortune 500 company, and it is. And one of my dear attorneys who left earlier this year, he's working at a larger firm now, and he's handling more corporate stuff now. I talked to him earlier this week, and he said, Anthony, you're not going to believe this. I said, what's that? Oh, he says, for the large corporations that we represent, if there's not a 5471, they let us know, and they give us a whole bunch of time. They said, oh, we noticed you're missing a 5471. Could you fill that out for us? No, we won't penalize you. And as you're watching this channel, you know that the IRS, when it comes to individuals, the IRS has been utterly brutal and completely inappropriate with the assessment of these penalties. So it is an important thing that if you care about your fortune, if you care about yourself, to please subscribe to this channel. We're going to be covering some really good things, some great things to give you the overview, the power that you need in the reality of really what's going on. So I want to really thank John for this post. Great, John.
Yeah, it's very good. It's excellent.
I mean, this is amazing. This is why you're awesome. And Keith, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom of what you learned from the masses, and from not the masses, but the individuals, and the things that they're experiencing every day. And we're going to get through this together. I think we're gonna walk through this craziness together, this path, and this cannot be sustained forever because it's so crazy. And we'll see what happens. So until next time, this is Anthony Parent for IRSMedic, and I thank you for watching.